Ideas and Insights provides a rich analytical framework for thinking about some of the most pressing issues of our time. Engaging, enlightening, bold, and original, Ideas and Insights offers new vistas for making sense of the world. Join us here on this channel. I am Badrinath Rao, your host for Ideas and Insights. Hello and welcome to Ideas and Insights. I am Badrinath Rao, your host for this program. In this episode, we will discuss the distressing state of democracy across the globe. According to the Economist Democracy Index 2020 report, just 23 countries comprising 8.4% of the world's population are full democracies. 52 nations comprising 41% of the world's population are flawed democracies. 35 nations are hybrid regimes, and 57 countries comprising 35.6% of the world's population are authoritarian governments. Astute observers of world politics almost unanimously agree that democracy and democratic institutions across the globe are under an eclipse. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in late 2019, democratic freedoms have been curtailed the world over. In countries as disparate as the Philippines, Turkey, Hungary, Nicaragua, Poland, Brazil, Tajikistan, China, Russia, Vietnam, and Saudi Arabia, one sees the attenuation of power-sharing institutions, lack of accountability, rampant electoral malpractices, and the rising tide of corruption and cronyism. Further, barring the 23 countries that are genuine democracies, across the globe, one sees systematic attempts to squelch dissent. That established democracies like the United States, India, and the United Kingdom are also not immune to these maladies only underscores their severity. The alarming decline of democracy has garnered considerable scholarly attention. Some academics posit that democracy is going through a midlife crisis. Others, mainly from China, maintain that Western democracy, having outlived its utility, is showing signs of decay. Yet others blame populism for delivering a knockout blow to democracy. Democratic governance appears to have failed to empower people, uphold their dignity, and enhance their life chances. Professor John Keane, noted political theorist and professor of politics at the University of Sydney in Australia and at the Wissenschaftzentrum Berlin, offers a seminal analysis of the aberrations of democracy in his latest book, The New Despotism, published by Harvard University Press in 2020. Professor Keane has spent decades tracking the trajectory of democracy across the globe and mapping the changes it has undergone in different settings. Drawing on a sustained engagement with democratic institutions, Professor Keane subverts received scholarly wisdom that depicts the dystopian anomalies of democracy as authoritarianism, populism, dictatorship, or totalitarianism. Instead, he characterizes them as the new despotism. According to Professor Keane, new despotism is a phantom democracy, a new type of pseudo-democratic government led by rulers skilled in the arts of manipulating and meddling with people's lives, marshalling their support, and winning their conformity. It operates in insidious ways by ostensibly embracing the trappings of democratic polities. Despots outwardly affirm their allegiance to the rule of law, procedures, and transparency. Yet, they excel in exploiting the law to frustrate the rule of law. How do new despotisms work? What keeps them going? Can we get rid of them? I shall explore these issues with Professor John Keane, the author of The New Despotism. Welcome to the program, Professor Keane. Thank you for joining us from faraway Sydney.
Thank you, Professor Rao. I'm delighted and honored to be on with you on Ideas and Insights, and I hope that we will be engaging and enlightening.
Let's begin with the title of your book, The New Despotism. Despotism is an old idea. We have seen despotism over the centuries, and you characterize developments across different nations as the new despotism. The question then is, what is new about new despotism?
Well, the term despotism is certainly seems old-fashioned. It hasn't been in currency for a while. It kind of petered out in usage, for example, in the United States around shortly after World War II. It's an old term, which I think in this book I try to show has real advantages for making sense of a very big development of our times. The rise, as you have already mentioned, the rise of a crop of regimes, Turkey, Russia, China, Hungary, Vietnam, the Central Asian republics, regimes that have a definite stability about them, that have a definite threatening implications for power sharing democracy of the kind that we have valued for the past generation. This old term, despotism, interestingly, was a key word that circulated during the American Revolution. I mean, the uprising of American colonists against the British Empire was done because one reason was because those who rose up felt that the regime of George III was despotic. What did they mean? Well, I also mean a type of power which is top-down, that is arbitrary, that does boss and bully, but a type of power that tries to win the loyalty of its subjects, that tries to seduce them, that acts as if it's not repressive, that tries to produce what I call in the book voluntary servitude. That's the specific meaning of despotism, and it has been since its ancient Greek roots, where the despotis, a despot was the head of a household, the male head of a household. So the father of the household had ruled effectively that household, women and children and servants and slaves, but was expected to rule in a way gently, kindly, to win the support and the loyalty. These new regimes, which I call the new despotisms, try to do that too. They do that through a whole range of very interesting mechanisms, which I describe in this book. To repeat, they are not autocracies. Joe Biden likes to use this term to describe Russia, China, and so on. If autocracy means, top-down rule through the fist, then this is a misunderstanding of how they operate. They operate in more complex ways. They're not old-fashioned tyrannies or dictatorships. They're not fascist or totalitarian regimes where the bulk of the population is afraid of the governing powers, where there are mass rallies to try to show the unity of the people, these regimes are different and they're puzzling. They ought to be puzzling for us. And what I try to say in the book is that it's very important that we dig down into these regimes to understand, to engage in a kind of despotology, you know, to study these despotisms, to understand the mechanics of power, to understand their spirit. And what we find are pretty disturbing things.
You call new despotisms plutocracies. You say they are wealth creating and protection rackets for the rich. You call new despotism larcenous states that work in favor of the elites, which is well taken. And you also say that they also take care of petty capitalism, the small and medium enterprises, in order to create the illusion that they are committed to creating a level playing field. The point, however, is that there are still millions of people in the countries that we've been discussing mired in precarity, leading desperate lives. And that does not seem to have any impact on the functioning of new despotisms. How do we understand this?
Yes, it's a paradox, and you've put it very well, Professor Rao. These are top-down systems of power. They're strong states that try to hide their violence, but they are states of great inequality of power and great inequality of wealth. One way that they patch over the tensions that arise that mask the reality that they are plutocracies, you know, with huge imbalances of wealth where governing officials and businesses operate hand in hand. I call this polygarchy. It's what Hungarians, it's the term that Hungarians use. So the great paradox is that great imbalances of wealth and power nevertheless don't produce explosions. How come? Well, one of the ways in which these states, these despotisms, manage this great imbalance of wealth and income is through state spending. At least 50% of the Russian population's lives are principally dependent upon state spending of one kind or another. The Chinese government makes much of its success in expanding tertiary education, in rolling out pension schemes, developing something like a universal healthcare system in order to encourage people to feel that actually life is improving. And many of these despotisms are successful on that front. There is one other important buffer, if you like, against conflicts generated by great imbalances of wealth and power in these regimes. Regimes like Erdogan's Turkey or Lukashenko's Belarus. And that is that every one of these despotisms has a middle class. Sometimes it's smaller, sometimes it's larger. In China, it's at least 300 million people who think of themselves and statistically are middle class. And what is interesting about these middle classes, I try to show in the book, is that they are rather loyal to the system. When they're asked whether they want open, free and fair elections, they say no. Do they think that American-style liberal democracy is the way forward? They say no. So they're comfortable in their privileges. They are skilled at grumbling about abuses of power, but they keep their heads down. Quiet loyalty is the principle of these new despotisms.
Which brings me to an interesting point you raise in the book. You argue that voluntary servitude is the linchpin of new despotism. You further say that quiet subservience is the oxygen of new despots. How does this work? What's voluntary servitude, and why do people submit to this phenomenon?
Once again, it's a very complex set of methods that they use. One of the key methods, and a point that I emphasize in some detail in the book, is that these despotisms are smart forms of rule. I mean, those who rule these regimes at all levels are very well aware that if large numbers of people withdraw their consent, then the regime can tumble like a house of cards. The rulers understand that ultimately power only works, not because it's a rabbit's foot or a magic charm. Power only works when people consent to it. And so these regimes develop methods, often skillful methods, of winning the loyalty of the population. How do they do it? For instance, all of these new despotisms depend upon opinion polling. That's true in China, that's true in Russia. That is, those who rule are mindful of public opinion trends. All of them experiment with public forums. For example, in the Emirates, there are happiness forums, or they have, as in Singapore, they have outreach sessions. And all of them use digital network media as early warning devices. The rulers try to communicate with people. And of course, they crack down on dissenters. That's a feature of their top-down power quality. But they try to be smart. They try to learn. The rulers try to learn how to govern efficiently and effectively. And when this works, this produces, yes, a kind of voluntary servitude. It's a play on words, of course, to describe the way that millions of people in these regimes are willing to go along with the regime. They don't publicly contest it. They don't protest. They grumble, and they may not be entirely convinced of the legitimacy of those who rule, but they're willing to tolerate and even applaud those who rule over them. They like their unfreedom.
Professor Keane, you make two interesting points while describing the characteristics of new despotism. And you say that new despotism is not monocausal, that it is a phenomenon that arises from the confluence of a multitude of factors. And secondly, you say that no despotism is fully despotic. What do you mean by this?
Well, the impression that journalists and diplomats and elected representatives and government officials in the West sometimes give, that these are regimes that are under the rule of the thumb, that there is widespread fear, that they are autocratic, that they boss and bully their population, and that this can't last. I think that picture, this book contests, because I think it's deeply mistaken. One of the striking things about these new despotisms is that there is public resistance to power. And it happens more and more on the internet. You can think of these new despotisms as harnessing our unfinished digital communications revolution that began in the 1950s and 60s. You can think of them as experiments in the arts of using the internet to control the internet. Well, they do this immensely successfully in Iran and China, who share details about how best to control the internet. What you see is that the authorities are prepared to allow parts of the population to vent against injustices, and allowing those outbursts, what I call digital mutinies, allows them to spot pockets of resistance, and therefore they can pay better attention to controlling the sources of that disaffection. Now, it is a striking and paradoxical fact that these new despotisms are earthquake-proof. I mean, even when, as we saw in the past 12 months, a major uprising take place in Belarus, these regimes have an amazing capacity, an astonishing capacity to regain control, that the rulers learn the arts of manipulation and pacification of populations. So every day in China, yes, there is some or other digital mutiny. You know, some local protest online, on Weibo, through WeChat, about some injustices, a corrupt official, food prices, or lockdowns. Protests against this, but from above, efforts by the ruling government officials to actually address these issues and to control them, to prevent major outbreaks.
Professor Keane, you raise a number of interesting points. You talk about digital mutiny and how new despots are deft in controlling and managing communicative technologies. We shall come to that in a moment. Let me draw your attention to a point that you make, which is very intriguing in my view. You draw a connection between hyperconsumption, hyperconsumerism, and hedonism on the one hand, and new despotism on the other. And you say that these two phenomena, hyperconsumerism and hedonism, actually are the bedrock of despotism. Could you explain what you mean by this?
Yes, one of the striking features that I uncovered in my fieldwork in many of these countries when preparing this book, one of the striking features is that in summertime, if you visit Nur Sultan in Kazakhstan, or if you visit Budapest in Hungary, you will find lovers strolling hand in hand. You will find people sitting in cafes and restaurants, at least before COVID-19. And you will find that there's a well-dressed middle class. And when you dig deeper, you find that there is Black Friday in Russia, emulated in the United States. There is Haranjome in Iran. There's Singles Day in China. These are shopping sprees with discounts. This emphasis on consumption, on pleasure, on happiness is one of the marks of these regimes. They fear being seen as ruled by the fist. They have a velvet fist. They're hard government in soft velvet form. And the emphasis on consumption, on holidays, on acquiring an automobile, living a middle-class lifestyle is something that is a very important feature of these regimes. They're not exactly Aldous Huxley's dystopia, where people are drugged out and happy in their unfreedom. That's overdoing it. But they're not George Orwell's 1984, where there's a kind of proletarian austerity in the way people dress and where consumer goods are in relatively short supply. These are regimes that try to deliver the goods, that try to maximize comfort of those they rule. And in that way, the rulers expect to win the support
but isn't it also true
those.
that not everyone can participate in conspicuous consumption? Not everyone can pursue a life of hedonism as much as they would want to, because they do not have the resources. Now, if you look at a country like India, there are millions living on the periphery who do not have any chance, not in this lifetime, it seems, to access the things that the middle class enjoys. So the phenomenon that you're talking about, how fair is it to generalize it to the entire system, given the disparities in wealth and income?
Well, you are right that it shouldn't, the point should not be overdone. It's also important to add that there are ecological consequences to this consumerism. There is definitely one of the limits of these new despotisms are to do with ecology, to do with the destruction of the biomes in which people dwell in these despotisms. But important is to see that there are other methods of ruling. Rule through law is a very important feature of these regimes. Look at the way that Beijing is slowly colonizing Hong Kong. It does it by emphasizing the importance of observing the national security, the new national security law. Of course, these regimes as well try to hide away violence. They camouflage violence. Much of the violence, the kidnapping, the disappearances that happen are done by unidentified thugs, as official media call them.
Right, but you make another point, Professor Keane, which to me is very striking. You say new despotisms are police states with a difference.
Yes.
You say they do not operate through denial and repression like totalitarian regimes of the past. Instead, they bewitch and beguile their subjects. In fact, you go so far as to say that their engagement with violence is calibrated, and you call it calibrated coercion. This, to me, is an interesting point. How does it work?
Well, that phrase, calibrated coercion, comes from a Singaporean scholar describing the way things work in Singapore, which is to be considered, I think, as the most perfect of despotisms. There are elections, there is plenty of talk of rule of law, there is a big middle class, there is an emphasis on hedonism. We've talked about these factors, but there's also forms of violence that are targeted at dissenters. There is a Chinese expression that applies to these despotisms, which is that there are times when you have to kill a chicken to scare the monkeys. Sometimes it goes wrong. Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. But the whole operation of disappearing his body stands for me, and I say in the book at some length, it stands as a symbol of the calibrated coercion of these regimes. We come back to the point that those who rule these new despotisms are skittish. They are anxious about loss of popular support. And they therefore experiment with a whole toolbox of mechanisms for persuading the population that they are a good form of government, that they are doing a good job, that they are protecting people against outside enemies. and that in general people's lives are on the make, are being improved. Hiding violence away rather than displaying it openly, as the Nazis did, as old-fashioned dictatorships did, like Robert Mugabe's in Zimbabwe. Hiding violence away is a very important feature of these new despotisms that makes them even more disturbing.
Another important point you raised, Professor Keane, concerns digital mutinies. A minute ago, you said that new despots are mindful about digital mutinies, they monitor them carefully, and they manage them skillfully. But at the same time, in your book, you say that we live in an age of communicative abundance, and this phenomenon of communicative abundance advances the agenda of new despotism. This is a paradox, is it not?
Yes, let's think of it like this. The old dictatorships, tyrannies, and totalitarian regimes of the 20th century sprang up in the era of the newspaper, of radio, mass broadcasting. Mussolini was one of the first out of the blocks to realize that radio could be a tool of mass manipulation, later television and cinema. Those regimes, those forms of power belong to that communications era. I use the term communicative abundance. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's designed to get at the way in which this unfinished digital network communications revolution is having transformative effects. We know that on our everyday lives, on our bodily centers. It's the first communications revolution recorded ever that combines text, sound, and image. It breaks down time-space barriers. We couldn't have this conversation without this revolution. And in general, there are huge increases in flows of information or communication, hence communicative abundance. These regimes very often practice state-of-the-art methods in regulating digital network communications. And once again, they do so in a contradictory way. Yes, they set up, for example, online public forums. They use online public opinion polling. They try to gauge how their subjects are feeling and thinking about various matters. And they do, paradoxically, allow for mutinies, local uprisings that express opposition to current government policies. At the moment, and in recent days, there has been such a digital uprising in and around Xi'an, this very large city that has been locked down, where there is a shortage of commodities and people are protesting online. That's a chronic feature of these despotisms. But the other side of the equation is that these despotisms master the arts of surveillance, of facial recognition technology, of taking down web platforms that are considered to be anti-government. They are violations of the principles of freedom of assembly and freedom of communication and free flows of information. This is the dialectic, if you like, that grips these regimes, which in this sense are different than early 20th century totalitarianisms and dictatorships. And they are different because this communications revolution allows easy copying and easy circulation at very low cost of scandalous information. If there is a local incident involving, let's say, a traffic policeman who bullies a motorist, that can be filmed. That then goes viral in China or Russia or Kazakhstan or Vietnam or Turkey or Hungary. And suddenly millions of people know about it, and the pressure is on those skittish rulers to do something about, to remedy the injustice.
But then, are we downplaying the power of new technologies? I take your point that newer forms of surveillance, new technologies such as face recognition and so on have empowered regimes across the world. But the same new technologies have also empowered ordinary folks. And I have in mind the Me Too movement here in the United States and elsewhere, which was, albeit limited in its impact, still quite significant in that it brought down some very big names in media, cinema, government, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to ask you is, are we assuming that new despots will continue to skillfully manage the cyberspace and always come on top? Might it not be that lay folks could skillfully use these technologies to organize and revolt?
We don't have a crystal ball, and it should not be presumed. Your warning is correct, Professor Rao. It should not be presumed that these are Gibraltar rock-solid regimes that have an indefinite durability, that they will last forever. No regime of power ever does. But it should be remembered, we should add, that these are regimes that have very large corporations operating within them that are champions of digital network communications. Think of the Chinese giants, Alibaba or Tencent. They are the Googles and the Facebooks of China. They are heavily regulated, as we know. They do indeed extract information from people in these regimes, just as Facebook and Google do. There's a kind of surveillance capitalism, as a Harvard economist, Shoshana Zuboff, has said. And those political economy forces help to explain the stability of these regimes. Yes, it should not be ruled out that that social movements, that civil society initiatives flourish under despotic conditions. We saw that happening in Hong Kong in the recent past. And we saw a major digital uprising, for example, in Belarus. To repeat, those who rule are scared of those resistances of #MeToo or Black Lives Matter type protests.
So those possibilities do exist, is what you're saying.
They do, and not to be ruled out, and it's another reason for using the word despotism, is the moment where there is a violent crackdown of resistance. That happened famously, for example, in 2009 in Iran, where, by the way, you may not know, but there was a fake election result. A movement, the Green Movement, developed. It was very digital. The government, the Iranian government, cracked down. There were many arrests. And I and Richard Rorty, who's sadly no longer with us, a famous American philosopher, and Jürgen Habermas, Germany's most prominent public intellectual, the three of us were named in the opening trial that the state inflicted on journalists and intellectuals and others. They named us as conspirators. We were described as MI5, MI6, and CIA agents. Well, I still haven't received my paycheck from any of these organizations, but I can tell you that dynamic where there is that digital, that possibility of digital mutinies, and mutinies that are met with violence, with open violence, as in Belarus, as in Hong Kong, as in Iran. They also happen. The puzzle is, how is it that people then go quiet and the regime continues? They have, as I say, a kind of earthquake-proof quality to them. And we have to understand that. And one last thing, one of the key reasons viewers should be aware is that these regimes have a kind of democratic quality to them. They practice elections. Rulers do allow outbursts. There is a public opinion polling, etc. But it's a kind of fake democracy. It's a kind of phantom democracy, as I call it. And not to be underestimated is the way that, for example, China and Russia, Hungary, and other regimes say that their form of democracy is actually superior to that of the American liberal democratic kind.
I shall come to that in a moment.
Yeah.
But let me now turn to a point that you make, which I think is very important. And this concerns the ambivalent relationship between new despotism and the law. You argue that new despotisms are, as you call it, a mishmash of legality and lawlessness. You say that new despots prefer to operate through organized lawlessness. So they have the veneer of law, they have the form, but the substance is lacking. Two questions arise. Number one, how does this system work, and how does it attain legitimacy given that it's hollow inside? And secondly, again, this might call for some speculation, but do you see anything on the horizon that might make you think that this arrangement, where you pay obeisance to the law but continue to foster and pursue illegality, that this will not go on for a long time?
Two really important questions. I'm not sure that we have time to talk about them in detail, but first, all of these despotisms have beautiful constitutions. They're flawless, impeccable. They specify civil and political rights, social entitlements, and speak of the rule of law in various languages, and so on. The reality is that the court system is in the pocket of those who rule. The court system is in fact part of the ruling apparatus. Independent judges, the independent courts are dubbed, Erdogan in Turkey speaks in this way, as juristocracy. And the argument is, we are a government for the people, and we rule on behalf of the people. We protect the people, and the people should not be bossed and bullied by, some unelected independent court. They're juristocrats. So there is this strange tension between beautiful constitutions and the reality in which rule of law, the principle that nobody is above the law, is violated. There are all those who govern at all levels in the system are above the law. Yes, there are corruption scandals, and yes, bodies like the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection in China, it's a party apparatus, go hunting for those who flout the law openly. But when it comes to the court system and independent subjects who are complaining against the authorities, they stand almost no chance of winning, and they actually stand a very high chance of being arrested and imprisoned. So this is a paradox. They seem to be systems in which there is law and respect for law, but there is a systematic daily violation of laws. This is the organized lawlessness of which the book speaks.
This still begs the question, Why do people acquiesce in this phenomenon and not see through it?
People submit, they give themselves to the regime for a whole variety of reasons. They do so because they feel that the disorder of the past or a future disorder, if the regime were dislodged, is unacceptable. They feel that their lives are more comfortable than they were, 30 years ago, that there has been material improvement. They feel that there is education and some kind of healthcare system that protects, their elderly relatives and themselves. They fear that if they step out of line, they will suffer. They will be arrested, asked to come for a cup of tea, put through the court system and imprisoned. They also know that they can manipulate the system through connections. Connections are a very important part of these despotisms. There's a wonderful Iranian film by Mohammad Russulov called Man of Integrity several years ago that captures this very well. I mean, if you want to get something done in these regimes, if you want to get your driver's license renewed or get a passport or get your child access to a school, you typically do so not through some formal bureaucratic process. You do it through connections, through someone that you know. Everybody is connected ultimately to everybody else. There is a top-down to the bottom system of what is called clientelism or patronage. Guangxi is the Chinese word. Blut is the Arabic word. Blut is, I'm confused about it. Blut is the Russian word and wasta is the Arabic word to describe a kind of system in which everybody is connected to everybody else. And as I say in the book, there's a kind of soiled solidarity. I mean, everybody is kind of corrupted by the system, but the system survives because you can get things done through connections, even though ultimately you're powerless in the whole order of things. So it's a variety of mechanisms that lead people rationally to submit to power and to fear what would happen if there was a regime change. They fear civil war. They fear looking out on actually existing democracies. They fear that their countries will become like that. That feeling is very widespread, for example, in China. Who would want an American type system of disorder and contested elections and violence in everyday life, say Chinese critics? Who would want this when we have actually a good deal of we have a good deal of harmony and order, and people's lives are not that bad, and they're certainly better than they were during the Cultural Revolution.
Which brings me to an important point you discuss concerning the relationship between despotism and democracy. You say new despotism battens on, thrives on support from advanced democracies like the United States, United Kingdom, countries in Western Europe, and so on. Why would countries ostensibly committed to democracy and democratic ethos work so closely with and almost covertly support new despotism?
Yes, it's a critical question, and here I'd like to go back for our American viewers to a point that was made by a Frenchman who came to the United States in 1831 and 1832, Alexis de Tocqueville. Mm-hmm. He wrote ultimately one of the great classics of democracy, thinking about democracy, called Democracy in America, where he warns that the main fear that Americans should have is the growth of despotism inside their countries. and they should also fear the way that democracies collaborate with despotisms. Well, the book details numerous examples of this cross-border cooperation. You know, France does billion euro arms deals with Saudi Arabia. The United States sells huge quantities of weapons to the United Arab Emirates. KFC operates in Russia and Uzbekistan. Google's Absha app, you know, is used in Saudi, and it's used by the authorities to track women. I mean, these, one last example, you know, the Black Cabs of London, the firm that produces these cabs is a Chinese-owned corporation. So, you know, the book tries to show that we should stop thinking in terms of Biden's autocracy versus democracy, or despotism versus democracy. There's an entanglement in the real world between actually existing democracies and these despotisms. And one last point, if I may, it is that inside democracies, disturbingly, I can see despotic trends. You know, the militarization of policing that's going on, the way that digital giants, conglomerates, such as the American tech companies, are, you know, engaging in a kind of extraction of resources and information from people, and people conform to this. This is a kind of voluntary servitude. And the flourishing of government controls during this COVID-19 plague, carried out by democracies, all of that ought to disturb us. And what I try to do in this book is to get readers thinking about the way that we're not living in a period where there are pure democracies that are sort of given, you know, the grace of God on the one hand, and awful despotisms that we should fear. There is a kind of actual entanglement, and there are disturbing trends inside actually existing democracies, which, by the way, are applauded by intellectuals and journalists in the despotisms.
Which brings me to an important question, Professor Keane. To the extent that there are no pure democracies and pure despotisms, that to the extent that they lie along a continuum, as you point out in your book, are you suggesting that new despotism is perhaps the future direction of most democracies if they're not careful?
Well, in your opening, Professor Rao, you very neatly and I would say scarily summarized the trends that are gripping actually existing power sharing democracies, what I call monitory democracies. The United States, Germany, all of the European Union states and others, South Africa, India, about which I've recently published a book with an Indian colleague. I mean, there are decadent trends in these democracies. And this book is a wake-up call. It is an early warning detector, if you like, that tries to arouse readers' interest and concern in the possibility that these despotisms will inherit the 21st century.
In the limited time we have left, let me ask you one very important question. As an antidote to new despotism, you posit the concept of monetary democracy. What do you mean by that?
Well, it is a strange mouthful to describe what I think has been going on for a generation in the world of actually existing democracy, where democracy has come to mean, it never happened before in its history, has come to mean nothing less than free and fair elections, something much more, and that something much more is the permanent public scrutiny and accountability of those who exercise power, whether in the field of, let's say, business, or in the field of government, or in daily life. There are many, many institutions that monitor power that never existed before in the history of democracy. Accountability mechanisms, human rights networks, future generations commissions, participatory budgeting. The environmental movement is full of these innovations, all of which have in common the scrutiny, keeping eyes on those who exercise power because of the dangers of the abuse of power. And what I say in this book is that perhaps, probably, the great weakness of the new despotisms is that these public monitoring bodies, independent courts, independent parliaments, independent NGOs, whose job is to be watchdogs against abuse of power, they're in short supply. And it follows from that, I try to say in the book, that the most effective antidote against the new despotisms is the protection and the nurturing of a whole array of mechanisms that citizens and representatives can build and exercise for scrutinizing power, for preventing the abuse of power. Because after all, what is democracy? Democracy, said very simply, is the belief that people are good enough to govern themselves, that they can choose their representatives, that they are equals. And it follows from that those who abuse power, who boss and bully and manipulate others, are engaging in anti-democratic behavior. These new despotisms are full of that manipulation and that bossing and that subjugation of people.
Professor Keane, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights with us. We appreciate your taking the time to talk to us. Thank you very much.
Professor Rao, thank you very much, and I wish you all the best with your series. It's been an honor and a great pleasure to be with you.
That's it for this episode of Ideas and Insights. Thanks for joining us today. Next week, I will introduce you to a new book by Dr. Anna Schaffner, Professor of Cultural History at the University of Kent in the United Kingdom. Dr. Schaffner's book, The Art of Self-Improvement, 10 Timeless Truths, was published by Yale University Press last year. It explores our obsession with self-improvement and its consequences not only for our personal lives, but also for how we relate to others and the collective choices we make. Join us next time for another exciting discussion with Dr. Schaffner. Until then, thank you for watching. I am Badrinath Rao, your host. Stay safe and goodbye.